Now we're going to the third part, and we'll deal with Fukuzawa Yukichi, who is a great figure in Japanese intellectual history. Everybody knows Fukuzawa Yukichi. There's no doubt about that. The rules of this game that he was playing means earnest learning of Western concepts and ways of thinking, but yet and still reinterpreting them from a Japanese standpoint. Again, it is not all out Westernization, but picking this and that, what was useful. And we all meet Fukuzawa every day when we are using 10,000 yen notes, which is the highest denomination in Japan. So he is very respected in Japan. I also respect him. No doubt about that. About his education. All people earlier that we dealt with had basic Confucian education first. And on that they added Western learning to some extent. Also, that's also the early history of Fukuzawa. But already as a young man, he became interested in Western studies and started to learn Dutch. And then later English, when that became possible. And in 1860, he, coming from a fairly poor samurai family, was lucky because he was taken as an interpreter to the first Bakufu diplomatic mission to the USA. To officially sign the treaty that had been made in 1854, and also to take a look, what does America look like? And the whole group spent almost a year on this trip, also sailed around the world and proved that it is round, so on. 2 years later, the Bakufu sent another mission to take a look at Europe. What does it look like? So with them, Fukuzawa visited England, France, Holland, Prussia, and Russia. And he became the best informed Japanese of the West of his own time. For a few years he was in government service, but then he stepped out and became an author who writes books and publishes and sells them. And they sell so well in Japan that he became economically independent and became a kind of independent teacher of the Japanese in things Western. The independence is also important here because it was not necessary for him to follow the policies of the Bakufu government, but he could write what he wanted. But sometimes he ran into conflict with the government, especially later when he started to publish a journal called Jiji Shimpo, was it News of the World? Some of the issues were simply censorized, they were not allowed to be published. But most of the time he was able to do what he wanted. (1862) was his last trip to foreign countries, but in 1867 he wrote a nice small book called Seiyo Tabi Annai, guidebook to traveling in the West. It did not necessarily mean that the Japanese would have gone on tourist trips abroad in great numbers. Nobody went. But it simply was a way for Japanese readers to imagine with their own eyes what exists in the West. And in this book there's a map that I'm now showing to you. And what we can see with the first glimpse is that this is not drawn according to European rules, although the shapes are quite accurate, but it still has this area as the center. Because all European maps at this time have Europe in the center. So he is consciously taking the Toyo, Eastern Ocean point of view. And Toyo is here in the center. It's not China, but it's Toyo now. Other small things, for instance, Europeans used to call at that time this area the first India, the front India, and this the second or back India, for Indian, Hinter Indian in German. Fukuzawa reversed these names and called this the first India and this the second India. So he was always looking from here. Asia is here, where it should be. The boundary between Asia and Europe goes on the Urals. This is post-Strahlenberg geography. And to the Black Sea and so on. Continents are clearly marked. And yeah, that's it. So he was bringing in European ways of thinking, but always looking at it from Japanese or Toyo point of view. Then in 1869, 2 years later, he published a small book, Shochu Bankoku Ichiran, which can be translated as a book that you can have in your hand, and there you can see the 10,000 countries of the world. Bankoku. Again, an old Buddhist concept used for 200 years in Japanese discussion. You see the world with one glimpse. And here he writes about races, because races, as we discussed a week ago, they became so important in European understanding of the world. The continents became less important, and the races became the big issue. And I like to use these small early booklets of him, because they display a situation where his thinking was not yet ready, clear and mature. He clearly had simply been translating from Western books and had not yet had too much time to think about all this. So he's translating. Hakutetsu hitotane, bummei no kyodoku ni tassuru kiki no sei ai. The white and fair race, it is the first race. It has the capability of reaching to the highest stages of civilization. This is what Europeans were saying about themselves at this time. And because this is an early text, we simply translated it into Japanese what was written in those books. So this is now placed in the same place, the Europeans, same place where the Chinese had placed them before, the center of the world, the most beautiful, the most wisest, most advanced people in the whole world. The concept of civilization has appeared in history both in singular and in plural. When we discuss the early Portuguese explorers, for them the world had several civilizations. They were in Europe one, and in India another one, in Southeast Asia also another one, in China another one, and so on. By this time, when Europeans were at their mightiest, in the 19th century, civilization became singular. Only European civilization counted. and others were not considered civilizations. European race theory also had other colors. Red people in the American continent, black people in the African continent, and brown people in the Australian continent was the interpretation at this time. And all of them were living at the stage of Banya barbarity. So where does Fukuzawa place the Japanese? Because this is a nice place to place oneself. He writes about the yellow people. Ki iro hitotane, Asia no hitotane wa iro skoshiku ki nare. Race of Asia is just a little bit yellowish. Of course, nobody is yellow. But here we have a case where a concept forces people to see the world in a certain way. And because it was written in those books that Asians are yellow, he also had to write so. But he had skoshiku. Perhaps there is a bit something. And then, more descriptions. Kankuni taehe benrei koto nasuttu yedomo. Son sairiaku semakushite, jibutsu no shimpu hanahara asashi. The yellow race is patient in case of hardships and good in hard work, but the intellect is narrow. And its speed of getting things done is extremely low. This is a bad, not very beautiful explanation. Who are the yellow people? China, Finland, and Lapland. This is the first time Finns were introduced in the Japanese audience. And the two great representatives of the yellow race are thus the Chinese and the Finns. He never says the Japanese are yellow. He simply did not place Japanese into this structure at all. Why would you write so badly about your own nation? Because actually you know that you are proud that you and your fellow citizens are also good people who can be intelligent and who can do quick work. But this is an early text, as I said, and repeated. So this is something that comes straight from the European texts and now turns into Japanese. He also has pictures in this book, and also in other books published at this time, members of the yellow race. These are Chinese, and they are, because this race theory also had class basis, Europeans always showed, when they were traveling around, they took photos or draw pictures. And in other races, they quite normally showed people from lower classes, laboring people. If they were doing hard labor, they of course were dirty. It could also be seen in their faces and the shape of their body. And when European people were depicted, they showed upper class people who had not been doing hard, dirty labor. So also here, Fukuzawa follows the same practice. Shina no Kajin, lower level person from China. And white race, members of the white race. They are clearly well-to-do upper-class people in good clothing. It's easy to look civilized when you show and depict this kind of people. And members of the black race and the red race and the brown race basically the same. They don't have good dwellings. They move around, they build lightly. And they fight with each other. They are barbarians who are not able to create civilization. So together with these concepts, Asia and Europe, came also race theory, now very strongly into the East. Came also politics. Great Britain, a civilized country, a parliament, where people in a civilized manner, by discussing with themselves, decide the matters of the state. Foreign policies and the budget and domestic policies and so on. And there's technology, ships are sailing on Thames, and the House of the Parliament is also depicted here. Good construction. When we move a couple of decades forward, it was clear that Western countries are planning to conquer and divide also China. By the 1880s, China clearly looked so weak that its ability to defend itself seemed quite impossible. This is not Fukuzawa's own journal, Maru Chimbun, but anyway, they published this kind of drawing, picture, in 1884. Keto Jin no Negoto, the hairy foreigner talks in his sleep. The Europeans were talking at this time civilization, how they are spreading education and liberal economy and good political practices around the world. And this is criticism on that. That China is the pig here, unable to defend itself. And these are European faces. You see the nose, the sharp European nose, and lots of hair in their faces. They are planning to eat China. So this is the real thing, what is taking place. This very famous ukiyo, it is said that it was thought by Fukuzawa Yukichi and then drawn, was it his nephew or somebody whom he knew. Peking Muchin, Peking's Green Pillow, also 1884. One of the most famous political pictures in human history, perhaps. It shows China here as an old man, lying down, smoking opium, eyes closed. He is in the opium dream and does not notice what is taking place around him. He's having an old-fashioned sword, but holding it lightly. There's an old-fashioned cannon behind him. The Chinese invented the cannon and gunpowder, but their technology hadn't progressed very far. There are piles of paper here. It's an old civilization. Lots of books have been written. He also here has a brush and ink and paper. He is not writing anything, the paper is empty. So China is in a sorry state. The French, because it's the time of the French war against the Chinese, are here. They are like Lilliputs. China is big, these are small, but they are active. They are running here around. They are climbing on the giant. They are building telegraph lines on the giant. On the sea, they are shooting down Chinese boats. They are simply advancing on all fronts. And here in the clouds, we have people watching. America, Britain, Russia, and Germany. He's even having his tongue out, looking at the delicious scene, wanting to come out also and carve out part of China for himself. So this is criticism against China. And also an argument that Japan should not be like this. Europeans are dangerous. They have to be guarded against. And let's go to quite famous Datsuaron argument for leaving Asia. There's also a slogan, that's so new, leave Asia and enter Europe. But this slogan never existed until the 1960s. So it is not an old one. And that's why New York never was Japanese policy. The idea never was to take Japan from here, sail to Europe, and place it here somewhere near Ireland. This never was the thing to do. This only came later in the 1960s as a criticism of a certain historical path that led to the Second World War and the Asian War. And Fukuzawa Yukichi never said this. I am emphasizing this many times, and let's say it also to the camera, because quite a lot of literature have been written from the 1960s onwards, where that's when New York, leave Asia into Europe, has been established as a kind of 19th century Japanese policy, but it never was. Even the author of this article is not known. He was not necessarily Fukuzawa Yukichi, because it appeared as an editorial in his journal. And the writer was Wagahai, which means we. Some of the editors wrote it, and there were several people there. But anyway, somebody presented an argument about Datsuaran, leave Asia. But at its own time, it hardly attracted any attention. It was simply published one day in the journal, next day there was another editorial and so on. In its own time, it was not important. Yet it is a very interesting cosmological text. So let's take a little bit closer look at it. And because we are discussing the concept of Asia and other concepts, I have been looking especially at this concept. Fukuzawa Yukichi and also the Wagahai, who has been writing this, now uses quite normally and quite often the concept of Asia. Waga Nippon no kokudo wa Asia no touhen ni ori to iedo mo. Sono kokomi no seishou no sure ni Asia no koro o datsu shite seiyou no bunmei ni utsuritare. Also it can be said that the territory of Japanese at the eastern edge of Asia, the spirit of our citizens has already left the old-fashioned ways of Asia and are moving towards Western civilization. Asia is not the battle place only because it is written in these characters, which are quite dubious, but also because all this race theoretical way of arguing about Asia. And connected with it, all the technological level. administrative levels, and military levels well over. So Asia is not a good place. And it is said that the spirit of Japanese citizens is already leaving. So within this concept of Asia, old-fashionedness is being placed. And so we come to the sentence, アジア全種の中において新たに一気軸を出し、主義とするところをただ脱腕虹におるのみ。Being within the Asian continent, we have to make a clear break, and the policy that we should follow can be written with two simple words: leave Asia. This means leaving the old-fashioned ways, but not the geography. I have looked also other places we have been using the concept of Asia. It's easy for the editors in this journal to say, アジア州のシナ帝国, China, the empire of China in Asia. But when they are talking about Japan, they easily say, 我が日本は一時、我が日本は地理上より言えば、こそ東洋に一律国。In the terms of geography, we can say that our Nippon is one of the Eastern Ocean countries. 東洋, the concept of old Chinese geographic understanding with the interpretation that Arai Hakuseki made 200 years earlier. It's now the place where good forms of understanding the Japanese are placed. And Asia is the bad one. You have as if two boxes. In one box you have Toyo, one box is Asia. In Asia you put bad characteristics, and in Toyo you put the better ones. That's a Toyo. Let's leave the Eastern Ocean. It's a concept that never existed. So there are still two different geographies. One is Asia geography and one is Toyo geography. And it seems to me that Asia, whichever way it is written, is an imported, rational concept. You use it for political and economic argumentation, foreign policy, government level affairs, but it does not touch you personally. It's not an identity concept. While Toyo is exactly an identity concept, which contains elements of Sino-Indian culture deemed essential, personal level. For instance, the Chinese characters. At that time there was discussion in Japan about getting rid of all things Chinese, including the characters, and adopting Roman letters. There were articles about this, and there's also a so-called Roma Jinikki, diary in Roman letters. Or was it Dasai or someone who wrote it? I don't actually remember. But so there was this kind of movement also in Japan. And Fukuzawa never advocated this. It would have been too much westernization. It would have been throwing away two important elements of being Japanese. And Chinese culture is also part of being Japanese because of the old history. It contains language and the customs, eating habits, family customs, behavior on the streets, food items, specific days for celebration, and the religions and so on. So important elements were retained, and that is the Toyo. So let's not read too much into this slogan, that's why. It did not mean so much, because Toyo would always have been retained. And I have now lectured on this a few more times, here sometimes in Waseda University, also in some other places. Because I think at the present moment there's a need, especially now when we have all this quarrel between China and Japan about the small islands in the ocean, to emphasize that the Japanese never left completely. They replaced China as the center, political, economic center, but very much remains still. Also not as close relationship that actually never existed. Let's go to Holland, because he has in his book a very good and very illuminating argument. Borders of Chinese civilization. In the 1850s, when Chinese diplomats came to Japan, they met educated Japanese who had Confucian education. And they were able to discuss with a brush. The spoken language was different. But when they used Hitsua, Bitan, they were in the same world. They could refer allegorically to old Confucian classics, and with this language discuss with complete understanding, with good friendship with each other. When we come to the 1880s, Japan had changed so much that you did not have any more here people in the diplomatic corps who would have Confucian-based education. This ended. And what happened is that the Chinese started to translate from Japanese to Chinese, or import Japanese concepts into Chinese language. This translation and importation means a visible existence of a civilizational boundary. The Chinese were still in their old civilizational world, and Japanese were no more. We still talk about this kanji bunkaken, sphere of Chinese characters. It still exists. It's part of the Toyo concept. But the deepness that very educated people could reach still in the 1950s, this is no more existing here. So the Chinese cultural sphere continued crumbling and crumbling and crumbling. And Japan had by now left it, by the 1880s. Japanese ocean geography is also different. Let's emphasize this also from the Chinese one. It generally contains Japan, Korea, China, but to some extent Southeast Asia is also included there. And India is the birthplace of Buddhism, and sometimes also Mongolia. But this is the nucleus. The Seiyo, the Western Ocean, well, it's also a concept that cannot be clearly defined. But you have Britain and the western parts, France, the Netherlands, at least in there. To some extent the rest of Western Europe. And of course USA also from the other part. And if you think of East Asian integration nowadays, the creation of closer relationships between countries here, a concept like Toyo would be handy, because it would refer both to old history and be written with beautiful characters and have no bad meanings like Asia has. But the problem is the Chinese do not necessarily want to use it. When I have lectured in China about this, they point out that this concept exists now. Dongyang, Eastern Ocean, but it means only the Japanese and nothing else. And it is used in expressions like the Eastern Ocean devil kids. So it is not sellable to the Chinese at this moment. But anyway, the Japanese use it in their own specific sense.